When a racist manager cut off a black girl's braids in front of everyone, it wasn't just an attack on her hair, it was an attack on her identity. But instead of breaking, she fought back in a way that shook the community and exposed racism like never before. What she did next will leave you speechless. It was a bright, crisp morning when Alyssa, a young black woman in her early 20s, prepared for another shift at the high-end fashion store she worked at. Her braids, freshly done the night before, hung elegantly down her back, a source of pride and connection to her heritage. She'd saved for weeks to get them styled, a way to embrace her culture while looking professional in the workplace. As she gazed at herself in the mirror, a small, proud smile played on her lips. Alyssa loved her job, or at least she had loved it once. Working in fashion had always been her dream, and though her position was at the bottom rung, she hoped to climb the ladder one day. But lately, things had started to feel different. Her manager, Claire, had always been cold, but over the past few months, her microaggressions had turned into outright hostility. Comments like, "Are those braids really appropriate for work?" or "You should look more polished if you want to be taken seriously," had become a regular part of Alyssa's day. Despite her hurt feelings, Alyssa had pushed on, determined to prove herself. But today, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When Alyssa arrived at the store, Claire was already there, her sharp heels clicking against the polished floor as she barked orders at the team. Claire's eyes fell on Alyssa the moment she walked in. Her lips pursed as she scanned Alyssa from head to toe, her expression filled with disdain. "Alyssa," Claire said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Come with me to the back." Alyssa's stomach tightened. She followed Claire into the office, bracing herself for another lecture. But what came next wasn't just a reprimand. It was an attack that would change everything. Claire stood with her arms crossed, her icy glare boring into Alyssa. "I told you before, those braids are not acceptable in this environment. They're unprofessional and distracting," she said, her voice sharp as glass. Alyssa's breath hitched. She'd heard Claire's criticisms before, but this time there was something more venomous in her tone. "My braids are neat and clean," Alyssa replied, keeping her voice steady despite the tremble she felt inside. "They meet the dress code." Claire's eyes narrowed, and a chilling smile crept onto her face. "I'll decide what meets the dress code," she said, stepping toward Alyssa. Before Alyssa could react, Claire reached out and grabbed a handful of her braids. Time seemed to slow as Claire pulled a pair of scissors from her desk and, with a single brutal snip, cut through the thick strands. Alyssa froze, her mind unable to process what had just happened. She felt the weight of her braids falling away, one by one, as Claire's scissors moved with ruthless efficiency. When Claire finally stepped back, the room was eerily silent. Alyssa's reflection in the office window showed the uneven remains of her once beautiful braids. Her chest heaved as anger, humiliation and heartbreak surged through her. "You can thank me later," Claire said smugly, tossing the cut braids into the trash like they were nothing. "Now you look presentable." Alyssa's hands trembled as she reached up to touch her hair. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Claire stood there, arms crossed, clearly satisfied with her actions. But Alyssa's silence wasn't defeat. It was the calm before the storm. The humiliation Alyssa felt wasn't just about her hair. It was about everything her braids represented, her culture, her identity, her pride. And as she walked out of the office, past her stunned co-workers, she made a quiet promise to herself. This wasn't over. Alyssa sat in the cramped break room, her trembling hands running through the jagged remnants of her once beautiful braids. The muffled sounds of customers shopping just beyond the door felt miles away. She stared at her reflection in the dull, cracked mirror on the wall, barely recognizing herself. Her co-workers had seen what happened. The looks of pity on their faces as she left Claire's office felt like tiny daggers, but none of them had said anything. Not a single person had stood up for her. Why didn't anyone stop her? Alyssa thought bitterly, her chest tightening with frustration and shame. She fought back tears, swallowing the lump in her throat. Crying here, on Claire's turf, felt like giving her exactly what she wanted. But the pain was overwhelming. Her braids weren't just a hairstyle. They were her pride, a connection to her roots, and a reflection of the hours she had spent sitting with her mother as a child, learning about the strength of their ancestors. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, shaking her from her thoughts. She pulled it out to see a message from her younger sister, Layla. "Can't wait to see your braids tonight. You'll look amazing at dinner." Alyssa's heart sank. Her family had always celebrated her individuality, and tonight was meant to be a special gathering, her father's birthday dinner. How could she face them like this, stripped of the identity she had worn so proudly just hours ago? As the day wore on, Alyssa felt the stares of customers and co-workers alike. Some tried to avoid looking directly at her, while others gave her awkward, fleeting glances. No one asked her if she was okay. No one asked what had happened. It was as though everyone had silently agreed that Claire's actions were just part of the job. But Alyssa couldn't let it go. Each time her reflection caught her eye, the anger inside her grew. This wasn't just about her hair anymore. It was about every time Claire had dismissed her, demeaned her, or made her feel small. This was about the silent complicity of her co-workers and the unspoken belief that people like Alyssa should just stay in their place. By the end of her shift, her humiliation had turned into something else. Resolve. That evening, as Alyssa sat in her car outside her family's home, she debated whether to go inside. She could feel the jagged ends of her hair brushing against her neck, a constant reminder of what had been taken from her. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped out. The moment she entered the house, Layla's cheerful voice called out, "Alyssa, let me see those." Her sister stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she took in Alyssa's uneven hair. "What happened?" Layla's voice was barely a whisper, but the pain in her words hit Alyssa like a punch to the chest. "It's nothing," Alyssa said quickly, trying to force a smile. But the tears she had been holding back all day spilled over, and suddenly she was sobbing in her sister's arms. Through broken words, she explained everything: Claire's cruel words, the scissors, the humiliation. Her father, usually calm and reserved, stood frozen in the doorway, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Her mother's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to hold Alyssa, gently stroking her uneven hair. "This isn't nothing, Alyssa," her father finally said, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "This is an attack on who you are." "But what can I do?" Alyssa asked, her voice breaking. "No one cares. They all saw it, and no one said a word." Layla pulled back, wiping her sister's tears with a determined look in her eyes. "You don't have to let her get away with it." Her father nodded. "Your mother and I taught you to stand up for yourself, Alyssa. Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been told to shrink themselves." That night, Alyssa stayed up late, her mind racing with possibilities. She scrolled through stories online, reading about other women of color who had faced discrimination for wearing natural hairstyles. She read about lawsuits, petitions, protests, and legislation. With every story, her anger grew, but so did her hope. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every black person who had been told they didn't belong, who had been stripped of their dignity by people like Claire. By the time the sun began to rise, Alyssa knew what she had to do. She wasn't just going to fight back, she was going to make sure no one else had to endure what she had. Her plan was bold, ambitious, and terrifying. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, she felt a flicker of the pride that Claire had tried to take from her. This isn't over, she thought. Not even close. Alyssa walked into the store the next morning with her head held high. Her uneven hair was no longer a source of shame, but a badge of defiance. She wasn't there to work or to endure more humiliation. She was there to take her first stand. Claire was at the register, her usual smug expression firmly in place. She glanced at Alyssa and sneered. "You're not scheduled today. What are you doing here?" "I came to talk," Alyssa said, her voice calm but firm. "About what?" Claire asked, crossing her arms. "About what you did," Alyssa said, locking eyes with her manager. You assaulted me yesterday, and I'm not going to let it slide. Claire scoffed. Assault? Oh, please, you're being dramatic. I was doing you a favor. Alyssa felt her hands curl into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to stay composed. You didn't do me a favor. You violated me. You disrespected my culture and my identity. And whether you believe it or not, there are laws against what you did. The mention of laws seemed to unnerve Claire, but she quickly masked it with a dismissive laugh. Go ahead and try. No one will take you seriously. Alyssa didn't respond. She had already decided that words alone wouldn't be enough to hold Claire accountable. She left the store and went straight to her local community center, where she met with a legal advocate who specialized in workplace discrimination. The advocate, a sharp and empathetic woman named Mrs. Turner, listened intently as Alyssa recounted every detail of what had happened. This isn't just discrimination, Mrs. Turner said firmly. It's assault, and you have a strong case. Over the next few days, Alyssa worked tirelessly to gather evidence. She reached out to co-workers, though most were hesitant to speak out against Claire. Still, one brave co-worker, an older woman named Maria, agreed to provide a written statement. I've seen Claire do things like this before, Maria admitted. Not as extreme, but she's always had it out for employees who didn't fit her image. Armed with Maria's statement, photos of her hair, and copies of her employee records, Alyssa filed a formal complaint with the company's HR department. But she didn't stop there. She shared her story on social media, posting a picture of her uneven hair, alongside a detailed account of what had happened. Within hours, Alyssa's post began to gain traction. Friends and family shared it, and soon strangers were commenting and reposting as well. The hashtags number Justice for Alyssa and number Protect Black Hair started trending, sparking a larger conversation about hair discrimination and workplace racism. Messages of support poured in from people across the country. Black women who shared their own experiences of being told their natural hair wasn't professional, activists fighting for change, and even lawyers offering to help. But not everyone was supportive. Trolls flooded her inbox with hateful messages, accusing her of overreacting or seeking attention. Alyssa read their comments, her heart aching at the cruelty, but she refused to back down. Alyssa's story caught the attention of a local news station, which reached out for an interview. Sitting in the studio, under the bright lights of the camera, Alyssa felt a nervous knot in her stomach, but as she began to speak, her confidence grew. I'm not just doing this for me, she said, her voice steady. I'm doing it for every black person who's ever been told that their hair, their culture, or their identity doesn't belong. This is bigger than one incident. It's about creating a world where no one has to endure what I did. The interview aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. More people came forward with their own stories, and a prominent civil rights lawyer offered to take Alyssa's case pro bono. Together, they filed a lawsuit against the company, citing workplace discrimination and assault. Back at the store, things began to unravel for Claire. Customers, many of whom had seen Alyssa's story online, started asking pointed questions about what had happened. Some openly criticized Claire, refusing to shop until she was held accountable. The company's corporate office was flooded with complaints, and within days, Claire was called in for an emergency meeting. She tried to defend herself, claiming Alyssa was overreacting, but the mounting evidence made her position untenable. Meanwhile, Alyssa continued to speak out. She attended community events, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand up against discrimination. Her courage inspired a wave of action, with petitions calling for stronger workplace protections and schools implementing anti-discrimination workshops. Though the legal process was slow, Alyssa knew she had already won in another way. She had sparked a movement. The lawsuit was officially underway, and Alyssa's story had become a national conversation. News outlets covered her case as an example of workplace racism and hair discrimination, shedding light on the struggles many black individuals face when expressing their identity in professional settings. While Alyssa's courage was celebrated by many, she also faced mounting pressure. Online trolls became more aggressive, accusing her of blowing things out of proportion. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, some supportive and others hateful. It was exhausting, but Alyssa drew strength from the countless people who reached out with their own stories of discrimination. One evening, after a long day of meetings with her legal team, Alyssa sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through emails. Among the flood of messages, one caught her eye. It was from a teenage girl named Mia, who wrote, "Hi Alyssa, my school told me I couldn't walk at graduation unless I straightened my hair. When I saw your story, I decided to fight back. I'm not scared anymore because you showed me it's okay to stand up for myself. Thank you." Alyssa's chest tightened as she read the message. It was moments like this that reminded her why she had started this fight. She wasn't just seeking justice for herself. She was giving others the courage to demand better. Back at the store, Claire's world was crumbling. Customers had dwindled, and her once commanding presence now carried a shadow of fear. Rumors of the lawsuit spread among her co-workers, and many began to distance themselves from her. One day, Claire received a call from the company's corporate office. The HR director's voice was cold and direct. "Claire, given the overwhelming evidence and the harm this incident has caused our company's reputation, we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. You'll also be required to cooperate with the ongoing legal case." Claire hung up the phone, her hands shaking. For years, she had operated with impunity, using her position to demean and control others. Now, her actions had caught up with her, and she was left to face the consequences. Months later, the day of the trial arrived. Alyssa entered the courtroom, her head held high, her natural hair styled in a crown of confidence. The room was packed with supporters, community leaders, and reporters. Sitting at the defendant's table was Claire, looking smaller and more fragile than Alyssa had ever seen her. When it was Alyssa's turn to testify, she took a deep breath and told her story. Her voice was steady as she recounted the humiliation of that day and the impact it had on her identity. She spoke about the broader issue of hair discrimination and the pain it caused countless others who felt forced to hide their true selves to fit societal norms. Claire's defense was weak. She claimed her actions were meant to uphold company standards, but the court wasn't swayed. The evidence of her history of targeting minority employees, combined with Alyssa's powerful testimony, painted a clear picture. When the verdict was announced, Alyssa felt a wave of relief. Guilty of workplace discrimination and assault. The judge ordered Claire to pay damages and mandated the company to implement anti-discrimination training and revise its policies to protect natural hairstyles. It was a victory not just for Alyssa, but for everyone who had been told to shrink themselves to fit into someone else's idea of professionalism. After the trial, Alyssa's story continued to inspire change. Her social media platform grew, and she used it to amplify voices advocating for anti-discrimination laws, like the Crown Act, which aimed to protect natural hair in workplaces and schools. She partnered with community organizations to host workshops and events, creating safe spaces for people to share their stories and learn about their rights. 1 year after the incident, Alyssa stood on a stage at a rally, addressing a crowd of thousands. She looked out at the sea of faces, some holding signs that read, "Protect Black Hair," and "End Racism in the Workplace." "What happened to me was painful," she said, her voice ringing with strength. "But it reminded me of something powerful. No one can take your identity from you. Not with scissors, not with words, not with hate. Together, we can make sure no one else has to endure this kind of injustice again." The crowd erupted into applause, and Alyssa felt a surge of pride. She had taken her pain and turned it into something bigger than herself. Months after the trial, Alyssa sat in her living room, surrounded by stacks of letters. Some were from young black girls thanking her for inspiring them to embrace their natural hair. Others came from parents who shared how her fight helped their children feel proud of their heritage. Alyssa smiled as she opened each envelope, feeling the impact of her actions ripple far beyond anything she had imagined. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a notification from a news outlet. Crown Act gains momentum across states, following viral case of hair discrimination. Alyssa clicked the link, her heart racing as she read the article. The Crown Act, which had already passed in a handful of states, was now gaining traction at the federal level. Lawmakers credited her case as a turning point in raising awareness about the need for legal protections against hair discrimination. The thought that her voice had contributed to real, tangible change brought tears to her eyes. Claire, meanwhile, had faded into obscurity. Unable to secure another management job after the public backlash, she had relocated to a smaller town where no one knew her name. The weight of her actions lingered in her mind, but she never reached out to apologize. For Alyssa, though, Claire's silence no longer mattered. She had learned to channel her energy into uplifting others rather than dwelling on the harm inflicted by one person. Back in her hometown, Alyssa became a pillar of her community. She worked with local schools to implement policies that celebrated natural hair and cultural expression. Students who had once felt ashamed of their appearance now walked through the halls with their heads held high, their afros, braids, and twists a bold declaration of self-love. One afternoon, Alyssa was invited to speak at her old high school. As she stepped onto the stage, she spotted a girl in the front row wearing a bright, colorful head wrap. The girl's face lit up with pride as Alyssa began to speak. "Each of us carries a piece of history with us," Alyssa said, her voice warm and steady. "Our hair, our culture, our identities, they tell stories of resilience and beauty. Never let anyone make you feel like you have to hide who you are." The applause was thunderous, and Alyssa felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what she had fought for. With her platform continuing to grow, Alyssa was approached by publishers eager to share her story. After months of hard work, she released a book titled Braided Strength, A Journey of Identity, Racism, and Resilience. The memoir quickly became a bestseller, resonating with readers around the world. In her book, Alyssa didn't just recount the events with Claire. She highlighted the broader fight against racism and the importance of embracing one's true self. She included stories from others who had faced similar challenges, creating a tapestry of shared strength and determination. The book's success led to speaking engagements, interviews, and even a documentary chronicling her journey. But through it all, Alyssa remained grounded, always returning to the core of her mission, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had. Years later, Alyssa stood in front of the mirror, much like she had on the morning of the incident. But this time, there was no trepidation, no lingering shame. Her hair, styled in intricate braids adorned with golden beads, framed her face with elegance and strength. As she prepared for another event, her sister Layla peeked into the room. "You ready?" she asked, her smile brimming with pride. "Always," Alyssa replied, returning the smile. The event that night was a celebration of the national passage of the Crown Act, an achievement that had once seemed impossible. As Alyssa walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, she reflected on how far she had come. Her voice, once silenced by humiliation, had become a beacon of hope for others. Her journey, born out of pain, had blossomed into a legacy of empowerment and change. She stepped up to the podium, her heart full, and began to speak. "This fight was never just about hair," Alyssa said, her voice strong and clear. "It was about dignity, it was about respect, and it was about standing up when someone tries to strip those things away from you. Today we celebrate not just laws but the unbreakable spirit of people who refuse to be silenced. This is our victory, and it's only the beginning." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Alyssa's mind was calm. She had turned her pain into power, her struggle into a movement, and her voice into a force that could not be ignored. As she stood there, surrounded by love, support, and change, she knew one thing for certain: she had won.